beyond tomorrow. How much of sorrow do you understand why I talk to you about the life of Keats? Why it is important to remember how he had seen both beauty and love. When he talks of beauty, he's thinking of his young brother, right? A brother at 20, between 20 and 25. Gradually, tuberculosis just wastes away this young brother. He's talking of new love. Remember, I talked to you about Fanny Brown and how she left him? Where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies. This is the kind of pain and sorrow that Keats had experienced. And therefore, what does he want to do? I cannot but read the next word also, next verse also, where he says, Away, away, for I'll fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his parts. One way to run away, one way to flee, is to use liquor. But Keats feels, this will not help me. I want something which is more powerful than Bacchus. Bacchus, remember, is the wine god. Something stronger than that. And what is it? But on the viewless wings of poesy, though the dull brain perplexes and retards. Imagination is of the heart, is of feelings. And you have this brain which keeps pulling you back, which says, no, you can't fly away. No, you have to live in this world. And therefore he says, though the brain, dull brain, perplexes and retards, already with thee, right? He is already with the nightingale. He goes on, and then he says at the end of the poem, adieu, adieu. The fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu, the plaintive anthem fades, past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? Would he love to wake up from this dream? Never, because the world of the nightingale is far, far superior to the world in which he is forced to live. Next slide, please. The inevitability of death is something that he just cannot escape. Try as he might, however much he might want to fly away, he cannot. But yet, it is the same Keats, my dear students, who talked about this idea of negative capability. I think that's a very, very interesting thing that he says. Keats himself, to quote him, says, if you really want to write about a sparrow, he says, Namita, you should be able to peck at the gravel with the sparrow. Unless you are a sparrow. Unless you can do what the sparrow does. And you have to imagine the sparrow, that little bird, the chakli, which is fast becoming extinct in our towns and cities. That little bird pecking at the gravel, trying to find a worm or a grain. You should be able to do that. And this is what he calls negative capability. And I think that's what comes across so beautifully in this poem, Ode to a Nightingale. Talking about Ode to Nightingale, one cannot but go on to what you so beautifully put as the companion, right? As a poem that has to go with it. If someone were to ask me which is a better poem, I think I would never be able to answer. There are so many characteristics of the romantic poet that make Ode to a Nightingale such a beautiful poem. But Ode to a Grecian Urn is even superior in the sense that he could bring life to a dead object. I'm thinking of the Grecian urn. And my dear students, I'm sure you know, the urn is a pot in which the ashes of the dead are kept. And what is Grecian? Because it comes from Greek, right? From Greece, and therefore it's Grecian. So it's a Grecian urn. Don't think of those small pots in which we keep water in our kitchen. Think of those huge pots which you might have seen in some museum. In ancient days, they used to store rice or wheat or whatever for the entire year. You might have seen it in some houses, in some village houses in Gujarat too. Huge containers. And you might have seen it in some exhibitions of Chinese pottery, the white and blue color. So you have to imagine something of that size in order to be able to understand what this Grecian urn is about. And then think of this young Keats standing in front of a Grecian urn. Maybe for us to understand it better, my dear students, I might give you an example of a cup, you know, a teacup.
Right.
And you find the designs on the teacup, right? Only thing is you will have to magnify it to the size of an urn. So on a teacup, you might find flowers, you know, a white cup with golden flowers, or something a little more imaginative. You have to go on and on with your imagination. So here you have the poet Keats, probably standing in front of a Grecian urn, huge. Think of it as being 5 feet, 6 feet, 7 feet maybe. And also the circumference being very big. Because only then, I'm sure, my dear students, Namita, you would agree, that we can then understand the pictures that he's describing.
Right.
You know, it has to have that three-dimensional effect. You have to be able to go round the urn so that you can see different pictures.
Right.
The urn, what is it doing? It is telling us a story. All of us believe. You remember, dear students, we used to talk about a pen picture when you had to write a character sketch.
Yes.
You know, in school we used to talk of a pen picture. It didn't really mean that you took out your pen and drew a picture, right? It meant description in words.
Right.
So we wrote pen pictures. In the same way, poetry also does tell us stories. You would agree.
Yes.
We have got many poems which tell us stories. We just talked about, for example, The Ancient Mariner, or The Eve of St. Agnes, or Christabel. You have poems which are narrative poems. They tell us stories. Now, the Grecian urn is also telling us a story. And that is where we have to remember that art tells us much more about history than history books do. What was the kind of life that was lived in ancient Greece? You know, when you look at the urn, you get some idea. So he stands there, he looks at it, and he says, you are a child of foster time. You are a child of silence because you cannot speak. You are a sylvan historian because the scenes on the urn are all from rural areas, and therefore, you know, nature and rural area. So he calls it sylvan historian. The urn is telling us a story, and he's sure that the urn will continue to tell the story much later, even after he is dead and gone, for coming generations. The same thing that he said in Ode to a Nightingale. No hungry generations tread thee down. The same thing he says here in the Grecian urn. So he's standing there and looking at the pictures. He is imagining the story that the urn is telling us. See, there are pictures, my dear students, but you should be able to interpret them. Why is great poetry great even after 200 years, 300 years? Because every generation brings its own interpretation. And that's what we are doing when we look at a poem by Keats, or we look at a play by Shakespeare, or an essay by Charles Lamb, or a novel by Dickens. What do? We interpret it depending on the age in which we live. So here is this Grecian urn. He's standing in front of the Grecian urn. And what does he call it? The direct address, the apostrophe, remember, the first characteristic of any ode. So he says, thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme? Poetry is also trying to tell a story, but he is sure that the urn can tell a story more sweetly than the rhyme. And then, my dear students, there are questions. Questions and questions and questions. Remember another figure of speech that you have come across? A rhetorical question. No answers can be given, no answers are required. What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape of deities or mortals, or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What men's or gods are these? What maidens' lot? And then he goes on, describing what he sees there. And what does he see there? He sees a scene. He sees a scene of people. He sees a heifer. A heifer is a female cow. It is probably being taken to a sacrifice. He sees that. He sees people walking behind. So you have a scene, imagine, of a street where there is a procession. Now, if people are there in the procession, my dear students, obviously they are not at home because they are in the procession. which means their houses are empty. I want you to understand the greatness of Keats as a poet. Not only is he describing what he sees there, he is describing what he does not see. Let me repeat that. Here is a procession, so there are people in the procession. Now, if there are people in the procession, their houses are empty. He's imagining what little town by river or seashore or mountain built with peaceful citadel is emptied of this folk, this pious morn. And little town, thy streets for evermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can ever return. Can there be greater imagination than this, Namita? To imagine the town that they have left behind, that town where there'll never be anyone, right? Because they're always going to be here. And as you said, frozen in time. They're going to be frozen in time forever. Is that good or bad? To Keats, it's wonderful. Because, as he tells us in the previous verse, which I'll read out now, he tells us that because they are here, they're going to be here forever. Frozen in time, but permanently frozen. They are not going to leave me, Keats is seeming to tell us, like my parents did. They are not going to leave me the way Fanny Brown left me. They are not going to leave me the way my brother, who died of tuberculosis, left me. They're going to be here forever. So there is an immortality about the art, which one can never get in life. And therefore he says, I'm reading verse 3. Happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu. No autumn here, no winter here, eternal spring. And happy melodist, unwearied, forever piping songs, forever new. Because when you look at it, Namita, you think of your favorite song. When I look at it, I think of my favorite song. And my dear students, at your age, you're looking at other songs probably. And therefore, forever piping songs, forever new. Each generation, each viewer, each individual is going to have a new song. More happy love, more happy, happy love. Forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young. All this, according to Keats, is far superior to human experience. All breathing human passion far above. Because what happens to human passion, my dear students, according to Keats, that leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. This is the kind of sorrow that he experienced. And this is the kind of sorrow that the characters, the figures on the urn will never, never experience.
Yes, Namita. I'm interrupting again. But this also brings out the autobiographical elements in all of Keats's poetry. And,
absolutely.
If I may say so, the urn has a painting with a brush, but Keats can paint with words. In everywhere that he has brought, in all his poetry, we find a kind of painting with the brush of words.
With a brush of words, absolutely, absolutely. A flowery tale, he says, yes. Right? Better than our verse can do. But you're absolutely right. The imagery that Keats creates. And my dear students, though it's not prescribed, I think you should go and read The Eve of St. Agnes. You know, the imagery that he creates there, the hall, you almost feel that you are there, you know, enjoying the party and the music. And then when Porphyro walks along, you know, it's a beautiful love poem also. Namita, it's enjoyable. When Porphyro walks along the corridor, you know, taken by this old lady to Madeline's bedchamber, what is there on the corridor? You know, what are these sculptures on the walls? How Keats is able to create it so beautifully that you almost feel, either with your eyes shut or with your eyes open, I think you can walk with Porphyro. The imagery is simply superb. The appropriate words, the appropriate colors, you know, the creation, you can imagine those little rosettes. And then he talks, when he wants to create that scene of maybe enmity, of horror, of impending violence, because these two are warring families, you know, Porphyro and Madeline. When he talks about all that, then immediately the kind of pictures that he talks about, the heads that you can see, I'm talking of sculpture, not real heads. When he talks about all that, the imagery is so fantastic. And then I agree with you, these are, you know, the brush of an artist. but the words of a poet,
Poet.
can convey much more. But in order to do that, you need a little imagination.
Definitely.
You know, there has to be that participation of the reader.
But then that was the genius that was known as John Keats.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we should be able to appreciate that very well. Read, my dear students, each poem, read each word, and then you'll understand how beautiful poem is. I honestly believe, my dear students, that after reading John Keats, you will be able to find more beauty around you. And I think literature gives you that sensitivity to beauty around you. You might ask me, will that get me more marks? No, but it'll make your life more meaningful. Remember, there's so much of beauty all around us, but we need the eyes to see it. The proverb, Namita, is absolutely correct. Beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. What beauty John Keats saw. And remember, my dear students, in a life filled with sorrow and pain and separation and death and mortality, if you could see this, I'm sure we can see so much more. It's monsoon, and I'm sure there's beauty all around us. I did say that there isn't much of philosophy in Keats's poetry, but I think I have to admit that when he says, "Thou silent form dost tease us out of thought as doth eternity," he says the Grecian urn is forcing you to think. I think there is philosophy there. Not the kind of philosophy maybe that you find in the poems of Wordsworth, obvious philosophy, but there's certainly some philosophy here. Keats was a fabulous poet. And Namita, one could go on and on and on.
Definitely.
But can we stop talking about the Odes of Keats without mentioning Ode to Autumn? I'm not trying to suggest that the other odes, Psyche and Indolence and Melancholy, are not important. But with the constraints of time, I think one should talk